I suppose it's for people to understand that there is a limit to how much we can take out of a sustainable resource, to recognise that limit is there, appreciate it, and also to recognise that you're not alone. There's other groups harvesting this resource, and you need to work together to ensure that.
If the stock's going up, it's about, sustainable harvest is higher than it is, so we can relax restrictions, and that's really what fisheries management is about. Your harvest level is tailored to the status of your stock and your management objectives.
It's providing precaution based on the amount of information you have, and the less information you have, you want to be a little bit more careful in terms of how you approach that.
The main point is harvest strategies are about a documented and agreed management framework.
I suppose I go back to the fundamental. If the fish stock is not in good health, it's achieving no one's best interest.
Hello and welcome to our Fisheries podcast. My name's Matt Woods and I'm joined by Nick Giles and Ian Knuckey. Today we're chatting about harvest strategies and the newly released second edition of the National Guidelines to Develop Harvest Strategies. For everybody involved in fisheries management, this is an important document. And in our podcast today, we're going to do a deep dive into the central role that harvest strategies can play in fisheries management. Before we get into it, I'd like to introduce Nick and Ian. Firstly, Nick Giles is the Program Leader for Resource Management with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. A long-time keen recreational fisher, Nick has spent 25 years with the department in both fisheries compliance and management. These roles have seen him work with a range of stakeholders to develop policies and management across New South Wales fisheries, including leading the development of the updated National Harvest Strategy Guidelines. Also, a major contributor to those guidelines has been Dr. Ian Knuckey. Ian has a PhD in fisheries population dynamics and over 40 years experience in the industry. He is a specialist in fisheries biology, harvest strategies, and has extensive experience in industry liaison, education and extension. Ian is the Director of FishWell and works on projects with industry and government, both in Australia and overseas. Thank you both for joining me. I appreciate your time. I'm going to start with you, I think, Ian. We'll jump right into it. Why is fisheries management important?
So fisheries generally work on a natural ecosystem, and we need to ensure the long-term viability of that system. So we are trying to manage fish stocks at sustainable catch levels, and that involves managing something that you actually can't see. So you are trying to manage what is going on under the water by the information you get from that, which is not easy. And there is a lot of things going on. There's multiple sectors harvesting. It is occurring in a natural environment. You've got changes to that natural environment. You've got other things that affect where the fish live and what they eat and feed and what they do. So it is a complex thing, but we need information to inform that, and that's the role of science in fisheries management.
Nick, why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I think, fish stocks and the health of fish stocks is so important to so many people. Obviously commercial fishers derive their livelihood from fish stocks, and healthy fish stocks can only support that. Recreational fishers and quality fishing opportunities are obviously relying on healthy fish stocks, and our Indigenous people have been, fishing and looking after Australian stocks for millennia. So, the health of the stocks are just so important to so many people, which means they're of high interest.
Okay, it's important that we manage our fisheries well. Are we doing a good job? How does Australia rank in terms of fisheries management? Back to you, Ian.
So Australia, as a rule, has very low levels of fish stocks compared to global fish stocks. For a number of reasons, we don't have the upwelling that a lot of country has that brings the nutrient waters to Australia. But we have a focus on fisheries management and research that has gone on for many decades, and given the size of our fish stocks, we have a very, very high level management of those fish stocks as we need to, and that's improving every decade that we see that the management of the fish stock going on. So historically, we have seen some species overfished and they're now recovering. We want to make sure with our management and our harvest strategies that we fish in a sustainable level into the future, and that's key. And on a global level, we're doing it very well.
Nick, you'd agree with that?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, we do have a high number of stocks in Australia, and the majority of them are, sustainably managed, sustainably harvested. But there are certainly some stocks which are have some issues. There's a bit of attention on that around Australia, and it's not only from fishing which can cause that, so not quite perfect. Very well managed stocks, but there's certainly still some work to do for some of our stocks which aren't going so well, or stocks which might not be at the target levels which can maximise the benefits from them.
Okay. Might be worth at this point actually jumping in with a definition, and I might get you to do the definition for me, please, Ian. What's a fish stock?
So a fish stock is really a self-sustaining unit of fish of a certain species. So they have similar growth rates, similar maturity, similar age rates, and they generally perform as a unit. So what we often have is even similar species that you may have east and west of, say, Bass Strait. So although they're the same species, we manage them as different stocks because they may have had different fishing pressure or they may have different growth rates. But it's generally the unit, the breeding unit, the self-sustaining breeding unit that we can consider a stock of fish. And we focus on managing the stock because if we manage a smaller parts of that stock and not the rest of it, you can have issues. So we focus at the stock level to achieve good sustainable fishing.
It seems that fisheries management is pretty challenging and at times contentious. I'm sure you've seen that in your career, Nick. Why is it challenging and contentious? Why is it so difficult to manage fish stocks?
Yeah, look, again, just the importance of stocks to people, means a lot of attention and controversial. We, have some misconceptions about fisheries management. A lot of conflict between the sectors is, quite the classic there. Those are certainly challenges. But I guess to think of the foundation of good management comes from, good data on your fishery or your stock feeding into a good scientific assessment, and you can get good management decisions from that. One of the challenges is, our management information is not necessarily perfect. There's a principle called the precautionary principle, which really boils down to, if you don't have absolutely perfect information on a stock of fishery, you need to be precautionary in your management so these stocks don't become depleted, extinct, etc. It's just a really it's an area with a lot of stakeholder passion around it, and a lot of complexity. We're talking about complex systems where ecosystem management, different stocks with different characteristics, is inherently complex, to be honest.
Okay.
I liken the precautionary principle to consider yourself walking up to a cliff. If you've got your eyes open, your ears open, you can walk right up to the edge of that cliff and you're still safe. If you go blindfolded, you're going to take it a lot easier. You're going to be careful how you walk up there, but you can still hear the waves. Take away your eyes and your ears, and you're going to be very careful how you approach that edge. So, it's providing precaution based on the amount of information you have, and the less information you have, you want to be a little bit more careful in terms of how you approach that. And it's the same for fisheries management. When you've got a lot of information, you can fish very hard up to a known limit and you're okay. But the less information you have, you want to be a bit more careful about how you manage those stocks.
Okay, so then I'll stay with you, Ian. Why don't we have more information? Why don't we have perfect data sets on these fish stocks?
Yeah, perfect is not something we strive for. We strive for good, sufficient to manage our fish stocks properly. And we get that, as I said, from fisheries. It's difficult because you don't see what's down there. So you need to have ways of getting that information. We have a range of ways of getting that. Most of our, or all of our commercial fishers fill out daily or shot-by-shot logbook data that records catch and effort. So that gives us a good insight into what's going on. For the recreational sector, we may have creel surveys where we look at what species they're catching and how big they are and how much fishing. But we also have fisheries independent information, which is the government collecting information about the fish stocks that isn't derived from fishing. So they may have surveys where they go out, use the same type of gear to fish year upon year upon year. So you get this long-term time series of fisheries information from which you can get a good understanding of how the stocks are faring. But it is expensive.
Okay, so who pays for this fisheries research, and why don't we just get more money invested in it and better research done?
So Australia is a little bit different from a number of countries where the government funds most of the fisheries research, and certainly...
You're saying in Australia they don't?
No, in Australia, the funding for most of the fisheries research is cost recovered from industry, not all of it, because we have a public good, obviously, in fisheries management. So a lot of it is cost recovered from the commercial fishing industry. But as I mentioned, Australia has generally low-level fish stocks, so the income derived from that isn't huge. So it's a balance between the value of the fishery and the cost of the research and management and compliance for that fishery.
Okay. Nick, if we spent more money on fisheries research, or the government chose to, would we have better data and better managed fisheries?
Oh, well, obviously you'd have better data, but would you necessarily have better managed fisheries? Perhaps not. I think what you do need for good management is to have good science, as Ian mentioned before. That is, it's accurate enough to make good management decisions. There can be a point of diminishing return in investment, in that, if, for example, if you doubled the cost of your monitoring and assessment program, wouldn't necessarily double the certainty or double the benefit or, double the economic or social returns, for example. So there's certainly a point of diminishing returns. And I would say it's not only about financial investment either. In fisheries, particularly in monitoring programs, which feed into stock assessments. It's about the information and things like voluntary data collection programs. It might be a recreational fisher participating in a recreational survey to derive a recreational catch estimate. That's incredibly valuable to management.
Okay. Has it changed much over the last 10, 20, 30 years, Ian, the fisheries management in Australia?
Yeah, over the last 30 years, there's been a huge change in what we see from management. Back in the bad old days, it depended on how hard you thump the table or who you know as to, how the fishery may get managed. Very different now. We've got good processes in place, and Australia has probably one of the best co-management processes where everyone gets involved, the different stakeholders, the extractive harvest sector stakeholders, NGOs, government, researchers, management get involved in the management. So we also recognise now that the sort of the quick dollar is not there. If people commercially fishing want to have a good industry, it's long term. So it's very much the long-term game now in fisheries management.
And is that commercial fishers recognising that as well as the managers?
I think it's everyone realising that you have to be careful and precautionary with how you manage fish stocks, and the best returns are the long-term ones, and you ride the short-term ups and downs, but you're trying to ensure you have long-term good management of fisheries. And that's where the game is now, and people recognise that. And you'll hear nearly everyone say, we're here for the long term. We want to ensure that the next generation is able to fish, regardless of sector, as well as we can now.
Nick, you've worked in management and enforcement. Have you found that there's a perception amongst fishers that management really is just all about putting restrictions on them, what they can catch, where they can catch it? Basically what they can do. Is that a fair perception or not?
Oh, I can certainly understand that perception, and what people hear and notice and have issues with are where restrictions are proposed. So yeah, I can certainly understand that, but I would like to kind of flip that a little on the head, because in reality, fisheries management is about securing long-term benefits from harvest, and restrictions can be a part of that story where needed. And that is, restrictions are put in place when a stock is not going well, for example, and the intention of that is to, I guess a simple example, if you apply restrictions and reduce harvest levels, that's going to allow your stock biomass to grow, and then as that happens, you can, relax those restrictions. So in reality, fisheries management is about benefits, but that can necessitate restrictions, and I don't want to, understate the. I don't want to understate that can also come with impacts, and I completely understand people's concerns with that.
I think one thing we need to recognise is the last 50 years, the efficiency and effectiveness of fishing has gone through the roof. That technological improvements in fishing gear, fishing hooks, lines, sounders, GPS, everything makes fish far more easier to catch. Now,
and is that just the commercials, or is that more broadly talking?
That's everyone, really. Everyone
Yep.
has so much better equipment now to go fishing with than they did. You think of the technology and the gear, regardless of whether you're commercial, recreational, indigenous. At least anyone can get a good outboard, a good tinny, and good line and good bait. But what's more, you've got exactly where the reefs are. You've got GPS. You've got radio communications. The whole suite of technology means we are fishing far more efficiently now than we ever were before. The capacity to catch is gone through the roof, and you need to restrict that capacity to some extent to ensure you have a sustainable catch into the future. So, yes, restrictions are a part of it, because our capacity to fish, our efficiency is huge, regardless of what sector you're in.
I might just pick up on one definition too, Nick, and I'll get you to give us this one for the audience's sake. What's biomass? When you refer to fish biomass, what does that mean?
Yeah, biomass is really just a metric of the abundance of a stock, and it's commonly measured against unfished biomass. So, for example, the common management target is to maintain your stocks at around 40 or 50% of your unfished biomass. So that level compared to the...
Well, maybe I'll pick up on that too. What is unfished biomass?
Yeah, so that is... So unfished biomass is a measure of the current biomass versus before fishing occurred. Now, in Australia, that's conventionally measured to a point in the 1900s, maybe the early to mid-1900s. And obviously that is well after Indigenous fishing, who've been fishing stocks for millennia. But that is certainly, it's trying to pick that point before industrialisation, before, big increases in, fishing technology have sort of occurred.
And that's an estimate, I take it. The unfished biomass is an estimate. What's this? How do fishery scientists come up with that estimate? Just briefly.
Yeah, look,
that's a hard question.
I'll probably hand that over to Ian, who actually works on these things. Because
so
it's very complex.
If you could, in a nutshell, Ian, if that's possible.
So it's trying to understand what the fishery was before industrial commercial fishing. As Nick said, it's not about Indigenous fishing that has occurred. And if you collect enough information, you can infer what the stock would have been like. So you know how fast they grow, you know how much you take out each year. So if you collect good information, you can work that and say, if we know the catches that occurred each year, we know how fast they grow, so their size increase, their weight increase, then you can actually work out that if the stock's here now and this is what it was then, this is what it would have been like at a virgin fishery level. Okay. So it's combining all the information.
And I'll just point out that you're using interchangeably virgin biomass and unfished biomass. They're the same thing.
Similar.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And in terms of biomass, we also talk about the available biomass, so that is what's available to fishing. We'll go back and forth between that, and then you've got the harvestable biomass or the available biomass, but you've also got the spawning biomass, which is the weight or the amount of mature fish there, or the female spawning biomass. So there's a number of different references we use, but generally it's looking at the reproductive part of the biomass, the spawning biomass. How is that going compared to how it was in the past?
Right.
Yeah, and so there can be really complex stock assessments. There can be really simple ones, can't they?
Yeah, so a stock assessment depends on the information available and the type of management you want to put in place. So in a heavily fished fishery, you might want to collect very good information so you can understand the spawning stock biomass. But even just a simple thing of whether you can tell if it's a male or female may lead you to say we're talking about the spawning biomass, not the female spawning biomass, because it's not easy to tell without cutting them open whether they're male or female. So it depends on the information you have. It depends on the quality of the assessment you want. And generally we see the stocks that are under heavy exploitation levels, we try and collect good information. It's like walking up to that cliff. If you're taking a lot of that biomass out each year, then you want to know those limits and fish accordingly.
Okay. We've got through some definitions. I think that's good because we'll be coming back to those throughout this chat. Nick, you developed the guidelines. You must have a fairly good handle on what a harvest strategy is. Can you give me in a nutshell what a harvest strategy is?
Yeah, most certainly. And and I would say certainly had a key role in updating the guidelines. But the first version of the guidelines was developed and published in 2014. So these have been in play for around the past decade. So there is a formal technical definition of a harvest strategy in the national guidelines, and that is this here. Harvest strategy is a framework that specifies predetermined actions in a fishery for defined species at the stock or management unit level to achieve the agreed ecological, indigenous, cultural, economic and or social management objectives.
Okay.
So quite complex and technical, but in reality, a harvest strategy just really sets out your management objectives for your fishery, how you're going to monitor the health or performance of the fishery, how often you're going to undertake your assessments, and what your decision rules are. And they are how the controls on catch are going to change as that stock health changes.
And Ian, you've got fisheries management, you've got harvest strategies and stock assessments, all different things. How do harvest strategies fit within the broader framework of fisheries management?
So harvest strategies are a key, critical part of a broader management framework. So there's a lot that is done on fisheries management at the policy level, at the regulation levels, at compliance, that doesn't form part of a harvest strategy. But your harvest strategy, if you like, is your everyday working part of your fisheries management, where you're collecting information to know the current status of your stock. You're running assessments to say, how is that status compared to where we want the stock at? And then we bring in the decision rules that say, well, if it's at the right level, all good and well, carry on. If it's declined, then we say, well, hang on, we've seen the stock decline here. What's the response? So they're the three components I look at from a science perspective in a harvest strategy, is the monitoring and the assessment and the decision rules. But there is a lot broader management going on, but it's a key part of that.
Okay. And Nick, do you want to talk to this infographic you've got on?
Yeah, and it's a really important consideration with harvest strategies, and the national guidelines do have this figure which shows the harvest strategies do sit right at the centre of your management framework,
right.
And contain specific components, and the thing to recognise here is, well, that helps you develop a harvest strategy, is recognising exactly what they are, what they're supposed to do. And it also means, they're not designed to manage everything in a fishery. So they're just one part of your broader management framework, but they are very important because these are about managing harvest levels.
Yeah, and I suppose on that, so we have two very key things in our harvest strategy, and that is the target, where we want to be, and the other one is the limit, where we don't want to be. And from a stock level, the limit reference point has been informed by what we've seen overseas and where we've seen fishery stocks collapsed, is once you get a fishery down to sort of below 20% of virgin biomass, you're on a slippery slope where your spawning biomass is and recruitment has been affected to a point where you're jeopardising your fishery. So we generally try and keep our fisheries at the target level, but we certainly don't want to get below the limit reference point, in which case you generally stop targeted fishing and let the fish stock recover. So they're two key, I suppose, levels that we keep an eye on in our harvest strategy. Let's keep the stock at a very healthy level, and let's not let it get to the limit or below the limit.
So you've got reference points of your stock. Can you just tell me what those? I mean, you've got a limit reference point, target.
Yep.
What are they? Are there other reference points that you're looking at in a stock?
So they're the key ones, because if you don't have a healthy stock, then regardless of who's fishing it, what objectives they want, whether they social, cultural, trophy fish, a feed on the plate. Yeah. There's a whole lot of different things people want out of a fishery and out of fisheries management, which is why it's so complex. But at the heart of it all is the fish stock. Now, you want to keep that fish stock at a productive level, which, is generally, most productive around 40-50% of virgin, where you've got good growth rates and you've got a good, highly productive fish stock.
So that's your target reference point?
That's your target, and it's where you get good yield from that stock, so you can take a lot from that stock without jeopardising it. And then you have the limit reference point, where you're starting to jeopardise your recruitment into that.
And that's where you don't want the stock.
And that's where you don't want to be. Right. So your harvest strategy will use information to start responding to a drop in stock status from your target down to your limit. They might have a trigger reference point in there where it says things aren't going well here, you need to do something, which is generally reduce catch, reduce fishing effort. Okay. But whenever we've seen globally, whenever stocks go below that limit, there's a big chance you're in trouble. So stay away from that.
So Nick, it sounds like harvest strategies are not set and forget sort of documents or plans. They sound dynamic. Is that a fair way to view them? That they're things that adjust based on the information that's coming in?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So there's a concept called the adaptive management cycle, and I'll just pull up another little figure from the national guidelines. So, and it includes a couple of things. So, around this table, you've got your harvest strategy, which defines your objectives and how you're going to monitor the stock. Your data and monitoring programs feeds into your assessment, and the assessment tells you where you are in relation to your management objectives, and your decision will suggest your catch or effort. So that's one point where things are adjusted according to the assessment and the health of the stock. But a little broadly, harvest strategies are generally reviewed periodically. It might be, for example, a 5-year review cycle where you have a look at the harvest strategy. Is it operating effectively? Have there been any changes in the fishery that need to be dealt with? So the principle is that they are designed to be reviewed and updated periodically, and we're certainly seeing that around Australian fisheries.
Okay.
And we have to have a feedback loop that's relative to the productivity of the fish stock as well. So a squid or a prawn behaves very differently to, say, a snapper or a groper. So you have species that live for a long time, have low fecundity,
fecundity being?
The number of eggs, the number of young it can produce. So, for instance, a shark might just produce a litter of, a dozen pups. Whereas a scallop might produce, millions of eggs. Yep. So you have to have harvest strategies that are relevant and appropriate for the type of species you're trying to manage, the stock of species you're trying to manage. So not only is the harvest strategy reviewed regularly, but also the performance in any one year. So you may have to respond a lot quicker with a change in allowable catch or recommended biological catch for a prawn than you would for a snapper. But the other point is that generally those highly productive, short-lived, early maturing fish bounce back quite easily.
Right.
So it's whereas a groper or a snapper take a while to deplete, but then take a long time to recover as well, generally. So the harvest strategy has to take into account the type of species you're managing.
And in terms of recovering species or fish stocks, I understand there's something called recovery programs. Are they the same as a harvest strategy or are they different?
They're certainly framed differently. So in Australia, we have both harvest strategies and rebuilding programs, but I see them as being very similar. So they should include the same elements. What are your objectives? So your objective in a recovery plan is obviously to rebuild the stock to at least a limit reference point, and it would be designed to do that within a certain time or biologically appropriate time frame. They I guess what we do have, we have harvest strategies which are designed and are managing stocks which have depleted. Yep. That below that 20%, generally limit reference point. And we also have recovery programs, doing that same thing. The main thing is that you've got a structured evidence-based management framework to manage your stock, and really jurisdictions might choose a different, framing of that.
Yep.
I do see one difference in that recovery programs are more about the government responsibility to maintain sustainable stocks. So the government is, obliged under legislation to make decisions to support sustainable stocks. So a recovery program can be brought in more as a bit of a government responsibility, a bit more streamlined process, because the stocks are in a bad position.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I suppose I look at the difference between a harvest strategy and a recovery plan is generally when the stocks are below the limit reference point, you stop any targeted fishing. So you are looking at recovery more than a sustainable harvest as such. So it drops from being where we're managing it within the limit and the target to where we need to recover it from we've had some stocks go down below 10%, which is not where you want it to be. So effectively you're pulling back on as much harvest as you can. It's certainly getting rid of all your targeted harvest to recover that stock up to the limit. The harvest strategies kick in then by taking it, once it's harvestable again, to where you want to be.
Right.
But there's also, as Nick mentioned, different management and different policies working there as well.
Yeah, but I agree. Yeah, I think you've framed that really well. Yeah.
Have we got any good examples of where a fish stock has gone below that limit reference point, and it's gone into a recovery program, and then it's come back online as a harvestable fish stock?
Well, probably the poster fishery for that, initially in a very bad way, and then in a better way is orange roughy.
Yep.
Now, as I mentioned about productivity of different fish stocks, they are a long-lived species. They don't mature till they're about 30, 35. They may live up to 150.
Wow.
So they can be, if they're fished down, they take an awful long time to recover. And it's a Commonwealth fishery, and that was fished way too heavily in the past, and the stocks went again below 10%. And basically, they removed all targeted fishing from that fishery for I think more than 15 years. And recently, over the last 5-10 years, it's recovered above the limit. It's getting back up towards the target, and so harvest has begun again. So it shows that
success story.
It is, and it's one where we have shown recovery. Not all fisheries are as some we've knocked down, and we're seeing very little recovery. Maybe another species moved into that niche or something's happened, but not everything's recovering as we expect. And we're also being more and more aware that, and Nick mentioned the second version of the guidelines, the impact that global climate change is having and the different things we're seeing in the ocean that reflect that as well. So we have this external factor that is kicking in and affecting what would have been our baselines in our fisheries. So again, that's making the management more complex. And the second version of the harvest strategy guidelines tries to work out how we deal with that, because it's hard enough to manage fish stocks in a stable baseline condition, but when you're trying to manage them when you know that there's marine heat waves where at 700 metres down we're seeing heat waves of 4-degree increase in temperature, has a potentially huge impact. So we're trying to manage with that and the uncertainty and the variability that climate change brings into fisheries management.
Even more challenges
Yeah.
for the managers. So, Ian, the orange roughy, obviously a success story and a good example. And I know there's one in New South Wales as well, Nick, isn't there? Of the rock lobster, was it?
Yeah. The New South Wales Eastern Rock Lobster Fishery has got a bit of an interesting story, I think. So I can just pull up a little bit of information to help tell this story. So our Eastern Rock Lobster Fishery is predominantly a commercial fishery, but also important to recreational fishers and Indigenous fishers. It's a small fishery in the scale of things. It's about a 200-tonne fishery at the moment, but it is quite valuable to New South Wales and obviously the people which operate in the fishery. Now you can see this graph on the top left. We've got a great time series of information on the fishery, but this fishery basically virtually collapsed in the mid-1990s, and it really reached a low point. So around that time, there was a lot of concern around the stock being depleted. The management changed. This fishery moved to a share management fishery and a total allowable catch management, which sets a defined limit for commercial catch. It's predominantly, most tonnage is taken in the commercial fishery. But that came in from around the mid-1990s. Now, through the early 2000s, that TAC was adjusted down because the stocks...
TEC being...
the total allowable catch
Yep.
was adjusted down, but it was sort of chasing stock health down. Now, that TAC became limiting and effective in around the mid-2000s in that it was limiting, total catch levels effectively. And that allowed that TAC to be used to rebuild stock, so restrain harvest to allow the stock biomass to increase. So what we have seen in that fishery, we have some biomass curves from the stock assessment. So the figure in the bottom right, which shows the spawning biomass for the fishery from the stock assessment. Now you can see that biomass was fished down through the 1900s, and around the 1990s it reached this low point. It was less than 5% of the unfished biomass at that point. Right. From that, following concern, there was better management implemented, but investment in better science, so better data collection and better stock assessments. And that was used to set the total allowable catch each year to restrain harvest, and that has resulted in the fishery rebuilding over time. And it reached its target reference point a couple of years ago, so it's now around 50% of the unfished biomass. Right. And so what we saw during that recovery, that total allowable catch was able to be increased progressively over time, and it's currently at the highest point that total allowable catch has been set in the fishery under its current management. And also the science tells us, if we look at a graph of catch per unit effort, fishers are using a lot less traps, so they're catching more efficiently, so they're operating with less costs. As well, a really important point. The same for a recreational fishery. It's easier to go and catch a lobster. So the point here is that good management can be very effective. This fishery virtually collapsed in the mid-1990s. Through good science, good management, its biomass has been rebuilt over time, and now it's around target levels. So it's can be a little unusual, but this is very much a success story. And this management has followed the format of a harvest strategy, and a harvest strategy is guiding adjustment of the TAC each year.
Yeah, great. Good news story. Good science, good management,
Yeah.
and we've now got a fishery again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, terrific. So, Nick, you're in charge of updating the guidelines, going to version 2. Tell us what the process was and how you went about it, and how the guidelines going to be used.
Yeah, so the second edition of the national guidelines was developed through a joint FIDC and DPIRD New South Wales project. So it was undertaken over the past couple of years. And the objectives of that project were to look at changes to harvest strategy development over time, to look at what issues are facing harvest strategy development, in around the next decade, how harvest strategy development implementation has changed. And to revise and update the guidelines so they remain fit for purpose for at least the next decade. Now we were, really appreciative to be able to talk. We talked to more than 75 people over a series of workshops and a bunch of project activity, and we had involvement from government managers and researchers, from commercial, recreational, and Indigenous fishers, the Marine Stewardship Council. So
That's an international body, is it? Or is that Australian, the Marine Stewardship
Yeah,
Council?
so it was the MSC Australia, which was involved in this, and they are effectively an arm of the MSC first started in America.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, but they are certainly, accrediting
So it sounds like
Australian
a broad
fisheries.
range of interest groups
Yeah,
around the table.
Yeah. So look, a lot of really good engagement and discussion to look at the guidelines and work out, well, what guidance do we need to support harvest strategy development. And I guess that really resulted in so the basic concepts haven't really changed, what a harvest strategy is, how you develop it, etc. But particularly everyone involved in the project thought some expanded guidance on the issues you need to consider, how you might think about things, and the climate change is one of those there, and some additional kind of sections and greater use of examples to help people understand. If you're talking about an objective for a harvest strategy is X, Y, Z. Well, what does that look like? So here's some examples of what that looks like. So a lot of the focus is on making them, expanding them to make them more understandable, more contextual, so anyone can pick these up and read them and understand what a harvest strategy is about. And
I think it'd be fair to say that the original guidelines focused more on commercial fisheries, as a major extractive sector there, and it focused on that, and it also focused on the management tools that are useful commercial fishing. What we've seen, I suppose, that the second version do is to look at the broader involvement of sectoral harvest sectors in fisheries and how we respond to their different needs.
So this is bringing in the other groups that you're talking about.
We did focus the first one on the commercial harvest strategy, but there's different tools, different management tools we use for different sectors.
Right.
And this looked at how we can recognise they might have slightly different objectives, social objectives, cultural objectives of different stakeholders, which makes it more. It doesn't make it easier.
Yeah. Right.
But what we recognised is that we need to make it more applicable for different jurisdictions to use for different fisheries. We have a mix of commercial, recreational, Indigenous fisheries and stakeholders, and we need to understand their what they are looking to achieve. It all depends on a healthy stock. That underpins everything, but then you'll have different nuances, I suppose, for where they came from. And I suppose the first guidelines were developed from a more Commonwealth perspective than state, and we're trying to bring in that different states are at different levels. They have different fisheries. They have different interests, and so it's trying to upgrade them to be more usable, as Nick mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, and So one of the parts of this project was look at how the state of play of harvest strategies has changed over time. And so here's a bit of a table which shows the number of harvest strategies which have been developed over time. So you see in around the mid 2000s, there was only a handful of harvest strategies in operation, but they've, a lot more have been developed than in all jurisdictions over time. And at the moment, there's around 85 harvest strategies in play. And what we've seen in the harvest strategies themselves is, as Ian mentioned, the first ones were commercial fishery harvest strategies, but we're seeing, all sectors integrated into, harvest strategies. And that's certainly a big focus. And there's a lot of interest in that as well from all the stakeholder groups.
You mentioned that these have been written so anybody can pick them up and read them. It's probably not going to be the case that there'll be a huge audience, but who is your audience for this, and how have you intended them to use it?
Yeah, so it's funny. A harvest strategy is a really simple complex, but the complexity behind developing a harvest strategy can be very complex.
Yep.
So they're designed to be usable by, we know, governments place a lot of weight on them. A lot of jurisdictional harvest strategy policy has been designed around the first version of the national guidelines and therefore the specific harvest strategies. So a lot of recognition and use by government, whether management and researchers. But they're also designed to be used by stakeholders as well. So anyone interested in a harvest strategy, wanting to know more, what are they about, what kind of consideration is going to them, they're written to be accessible, for everyone. And the guidelines do include, there's the national guidelines themselves. We've also got a summary of the national guidelines, which boils down to the key concepts or information to help people lean into harvest strategies and what they're about. And we do also have a background report which has more context on, well, how has harvest strategy development changed? What are the key issues? All that kind of stuff. So that's really fed into, what needs to be updated in the second edition of the guidelines.
It sounds like one of the advantages of having these guidelines is that you get some consistency with harvest strategies across different sectors and different jurisdictions. Ian, is that right? And if it is, why is that important?
One of the key things that makes it important is fish stocks don't respect boundaries. They don't respect boundaries between state waters and Commonwealth waters, between New South Wales, say, and Queensland. So we have fish stocks that are moving or not moving, just exist across borders. So if different jurisdictions have different approaches, then it can lead to undermining the value and the potential use of that. So by unifying the different jurisdictions and their approaches through harvest strategies, we're sort of all pulling in the same direction a little bit. So we're trying to make sure that we're achieving good stock outcomes to support sustainable harvest, regardless of which jurisdiction it's in. And many of our stocks do have jurisdictional boundaries in them that don't represent the stock. So if we're working together towards that, we're far more likely to achieve it rather than just focusing on a certain part of the stock where the other one may not be managed as well. So we're trying to unify that, bring it all together so we have effective, I suppose, fisheries management.
Okay. So let's go to a little bit of detail on harvest strategies. What are the main components of them?
Yeah, so the national guidelines do set out the main components of the harvest strategy. And this is about that consistency. So, they're, including the right things. So here's a slide, the important, they're all important parts, but, define operational objectives. So, the specific target level of your stock or stocks you might want to achieve. Indicators of fishery performance, so what metric you're going to use to assess your stock health. It might be biomass or catch per unit effort. There's some choices to be made there. Reference points for your indicators, so that is, we've talked about a common target reference, biomass target reference point of 40 to 50% of biomass. That's really tailored to the fishery and what the benefits are sought for it. A statement around levels of risk. So that is, harvest strategies need developers to consider the risk of not meeting the harvest strategy objectives. The monitoring strategy, so what data is going to be collected, a process for assessing the fishery performance, so the stock assessments, including the stock assessment cycle, for example, and the decision rules, and they are, how your harvest strategy will change your catch or effort levels in order to ensure that you're meeting the strategy objectives. So very defined elements. They can be written a little differently by the different jurisdiction, for example, but the commonality of the elements means that you can clearly work towards joint goals, for example.
And these elements are driven a lot by the type of fishery, the type of information that's available. So, you can have some very community-based fisheries which have multi-species and work in an area. You can have very targeted single-species fisheries. So the type of information we get really determines some of those indicators. So, we may only have catch for some species or some stocks. We may have catch per unit effort, which is looking how much you get for a certain level of fishing effort. Or you may have in your top level fisheries these fishery independent surveys. Now your indicators can be based on the type of information you have for that fishery, and you look at that. So if we've got some fisheries around Australia that are almost solely driven by the results of a fishery independent survey. We've got others where it may be driven by the size, the size in the recreational catch. So it's all tailored to the specific stock you're working with. And we're trying to get enough information coming in to inform how we're performing against those reference levels.
And when it comes to actually developing a harvest strategy, what's it look like? How does the process work? And maybe Nick can talk to that.
Yeah, so generally harvest strategies are developed, most commonly by some, a working group or maybe a management advisory committee. So it's generally a relatively small group of government people and stakeholders. So the stakeholder involvement is very important in this space, which will develop a harvest strategy. They're commonly put out for public consultation, for example, to get feedback on the harvest strategy. That process can look different depending on the arrangements in place in the jurisdiction. From that, the harvest strategy, can be reviewed, updated and adjusted and, ultimately approved and put into play. We did talk before about, there's also this periodic review cycle built into harvest strategies. They are complex. Your first harvest strategy, for example, you might not get it quite right, or might take time to develop better data or assessments or whatever, and that's fine. The point is, it's a process of progressive improvement in your management.
What we often do is do a harvest strategy evaluation. Because of the computing power we've got now, we can test scenarios here where we say, what would happen if we allowed this level of fishing effort, or what if we had a closed season, or what if we changed the size limit. We can use computer models to effectively assess how we expect our harvest strategies to perform in theory. And you'll do your first harvest strategy, you'll run a harvest strategy evaluation and say, well, that seems to perform well. The real world then kicks in, and you may need to look at that and say, okay, we didn't expect that to happen, or people behave differently because of it, and you have to rejig it. So we try to.
So that's comparing real world against your model data and saying.
Yeah, well, you start with your modelled idea of how it'll perform, and best practice again is to use that to inform your harvest strategy. So you can say, well, we think this is more likely to achieve our objectives. You run through that process and you say, okay, well, let's implement that. And then you've got, 5 years, so you see the data that comes in over that time and you say, well, okay, that wasn't bad, but we could improve this or we could improve that. So that's the review process. We've also had recently, I mentioned before, climate change impacts on some fisheries. I mean, we had one, event back in 2016-17 where we saw the coral bleaching in the Great Australian Bight, we saw mangrove die off in the whole top end, we saw kelp die off Western Australia. So a huge impact in what's supporting the ecosystems that are supporting fisheries. So often harvest strategies have these exceptional circumstances where you can say, this is beyond what we modelled, this is beyond what we expected, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and allow for that. And it's not just ecosystem. We've seen, just recently, big impacts on fuel prices, which affect the, fisheries that are managing towards economic yield. It's huge. When your fuel prices triple, then it's going to affect that. We've also seen markets come and go. There was a time when some markets were just cut off, and you have to then deal with a fishery whose value was this much, go to this much, and it changes all the complex interactions that are involved in management. So we do have exceptional circumstances clauses in some management strategies where if something comes out of the blue that you don't expect, you can respond to that as well. And that's why, again, this review is necessary, because it's, in a whole lot of ways we're seeing at the moment this world is not stable in terms of climate, in terms of economics, and we have to manage those fisheries in that uncertain environment.
When you're setting up these harvest strategies and managing fisheries, you've got interest groups around the table. They can often have competing interests in that fishery. How do you balance that? You might have the rec fishers looking out and seeing the commercial fishers. They think they're taking all the fish. We want our share. There must be some tensions associated with that. How do you work through that and balance that?
It is one of the more difficult things about fisheries management, without a doubt. I suppose I go back to the fundamental. If the fish stock is not in good health, it's achieving no one's best interest. So number one is get the fish stock to a point where it is actually productive, sustainable, and work from there. And that's when the managers make their money then, is by looking at, you have multi-sectoral interests, and you're looking at the balance between that. And obviously politics kicks in there, different stakeholder groups. But if you've got, and this is what harvest strategy, remember we spoke about the overarching management, that may be how you allocate to different sectors. But the harvest strategy part of that is irrespective of that, because we're trying to maintain, well, largely irrespective, trying to maintain a healthy stock from which all stakeholders can achieve what they want out of it. So it is difficult. I'm not a manager. I've taken the easy route out, but it is a difficult area to manage. But, we have Australian consumers that want to eat Australian seafood. We have people that their livelihoods depend on catching fish. We have Indigenous groups that, it's a very important part of subsistence and their ceremonies and their learning and their culture. So we want different things, but all of them require healthy fish stocks, and that's really what the harvest strategies are aimed at doing.
So, Nick, would it be fair to say that you start with the science, you know where you want that fish stock, and then the rest is sort of negotiating with the interest groups, but science here is the most important thing. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, look, good science is really important to good management decisions. And the negotiation piece, there is a lot of conflict between sectors in particular, but actually there's a lot of commonality. Ian alluded to it there. Everyone wants healthy fish stocks. So the question is, how do you get there? The negotiation piece can certainly be a thing, and particularly, that's around your management target. So, for example, a harvest strategy, looks to set where you want your stock to be, and the level that you set it at can influence the benefits. And it can be maximum sustainable yield might be a target where the highest sustainable yield from a fishery is appropriate. You might have something different. And maximum economic yield is generally a slightly lower level of harvest, but your fishing is more efficient. It's mainly framed around economic viability and profitability.
So
but
just to pick up on that one, what are you basically saying, that maximum economic yield means that you're setting your targets lower, there's more fish in the ocean, it's easier to catch those fish?
Indeed.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's really a balance of your stock abundance and your level of yield.
Well, so why would you set an MSY as against a maximum sustainable yield, MSY, compared to an MEY, maximum economic yield? You know, it sounds like MEY is more sustainable. So why wouldn't you just set it always at that?
Oh, look, MSY and MEY are equally sustainable.
Yep.
Okay, you're in that sustainable, your stock can replenish itself. You've got no problems there. It's just about whether you value gross tonnage over fishing efficiency or vice versa. And this is a concept which is equally applicable to management of any sector as well. It's just that balance of abundance, how easy you are to catch versus a level of yield. Now, there's one, potential misconception in this space. It's a balancing point. So obviously, everyone wants stock to be above your limit reference point, your B20, and then depending on the fishery, you might value yield over, fishing efficiency. But the important point is here, so some people say, well, we want to maintain our stock around 90% of the unfished biomass. We have really abundant stocks, but that means you need to have a very small amount of harvest. Okay, so that's something which can be sometimes difficult to understand, but your management target is around that sweet spot to maximise the benefits from your fishery. Now, the balancing question. I've certainly been in rooms where we've, sort of discussed this, and in reality, I think there's a lot of, commonality in that sweet point. It's commonly around, 50% of the unfished biomass, and that's about those balanced benefits across the fishing sectors.
And you mentioned a while back, Matt, that science comes first.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it does. It's the objective. It's what you want to achieve out of a fishery, whether it be social, cultural, yield. It's what you want to achieve, and that frames then the type of information you need to support that. So we sort of decide what it is we want out of a fishery, whether it's been an established or fishery or not, looking at what we want to achieve and then saying, okay, well, what type of information do we need to demonstrate that we're achieving that? So it's really that first process that Nick spoke about, the coming together of the managers, researchers and the different sectors and the NGOs and the government coming together to say, what is it we expect out of our fishery in the future? And once that's established, generally, you then say, well, what type of information would support that? What type of information informs your assessment? And then ultimately your decision rules. So even though as a researcher, I'd love to say, yeah, the science comes first, these are complex interactions of people. There's a lot of social science information in there. There's a lot of people working together to achieve what they want out of a fishery. So the science comes in behind and supports the objectives that you're trying to achieve, which can be, different in different areas of the fishery. Like it may be very different in a big population centre compared to a remote rural setting. It sort of depends on what stocks you're managing and where you're managing it and what you want to achieve from those stocks.
And just to pick up on one thing, what are decision rules? You mentioned those.
So decision rules are a very key aspect of a harvest strategy. So we get the information, that informs an assessment, and the assessment says this is the status of the stock. Is it stable? Is it a good level? Is it a bad level? Is it going up or going down? What used to happen is sort of regardless of where that was, people would thump the table and say, well, I expect this or I want this. The value of a decision rule is it's made beforehand, so when you meet those criteria, you respond accordingly.
So your fish stock gets to a certain level, and then you're going to respond by pulling some sort of levers at that point. Is that
Yes.
what you're talking about?
But they're pre-agreed, and that's
Yeah.
the value of a harvest strategy. Is you're not all of a sudden trying to scramble around and say, what are we going to do now? This has happened. You've pre-agreed. You've said, well, if the stock reaches this level, we're going to reduce fishing effort or some other way of reducing the catch. And that's agreed. And it makes it far more difficult for individuals or interest groups to go, oh, we want this to happen, because you have a pre-agreed response to a certain stock status. And it really does help out, because the worst time to try and make change is when people are suffering, or the stocks are suffering, or people can't get what they want. That's when people are really struggling. Far better to have it in advance, best of all, to avoid those situations, but agree that this is where we want the stock to be and respond accordingly. So the decision rules are not, what do we do now all of a sudden? They're pre-agreed, I think, is the key part of that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think they're about, ideally a gradual adjustment. If the stock's starting to go down, you have a management decision maybe to reduce catch a bit, to push it back up, rather than all of a sudden going, we're below 20%, we need to shut the fishery. That's...
And that has happened where
Yeah.
people, although the writing's on the wall, there hasn't been a decision rule in place, and they say, she'll be right, she'll be right, she'll be right. All of a sudden it's not right, and you have to make a big change, which everyone complains about, rather than having incremental change to try and reduce, get the stock back,
Yep.
So, were you going to say something, Nick?
Yeah, I would just say, so we tend to talk about, if the stock's going down, we need to, the restrictions, all that kind of conversation, but it applies in reverse. If the stock's going up, it's about, we can... Sustainable harvest is higher than it is, so we can relax restrictions, and that's really what fisheries management is about. Your harvest level is tailored to the status of your stock and your management objectives.
And I think history's played a role in that, because earlier on there were quite a few stocks that were in strife, and so every time people saw a harvest strategy, they saw, oh, this is pain coming. Because we really did have to recover, or certainly lift up the stocks. But Nick's very right. When you have stocks operating around where you want them to be, then there is basically, by definition, as many ups as there is down, because it never stays like that, never stays rock solid. It goes up and down. And so when the stocks are good, you might get larger catches or, increased bag limits. And when the stocks are lower, you get the reverse. So when the fishery is where you want them, the pain is less, and there is good and bad, and people are willing to accept it. And I think the trouble was initially is we were trying to build stocks up, a lot of stocks up, and that they said, oh, this is only a build-up thing, but it actually does go both ways.
Yeah.
So in summary, question to both of you. I'll start with you, Nick. If you can send one message out to our audience, fishers, managers, the whole lot, what would it be about the importance of harvest strategies and them also providing you with good data? Because that's a part of it, is data coming back from the industries.
Yep. I could probably pick a dozen things to point out, but look, I think about the main point is harvest strategies are about a documented and agreed management framework. They highlight and rely on good data, so that feeding into your assessments, and the operation of its harvest strategy itself is about maximising benefits.
Okay, Ian, what's your main message?
I suppose it's for people to understand that there is a limit to how much we can take out of a sustainable resource, to recognise that limit is there, appreciate it, and also to recognise that you're not alone. There's other groups harvesting this resource, and you need to work together to ensure that. So once there's a recognition that there's multiple people or multiple groups harvesting, they all have a right to be there, accept that, and work together for a sustainable stock is, I think, where we're trying to get to. And the harvest strategy guidelines are a key way of how you approach that to get to that endpoint.
Terrific. And finally, Nick, for people that want further information, where can they go to find that?
Yeah, certainly. So the national guidelines themselves are published on the FIDC website. You can do a search for the project. The number is FIDC 2021-135, or just search the name. Also on the DPIRD New South Wales website.
DPIRD is DPI.
Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development in New South Wales. We have a website which has a section of the harvest strategy section of the website that includes New South Wales harvest strategies. The national guidelines themselves are linked to the harvest strategy, the Australian harvest strategy database, which is a database which includes all Australian harvest strategies. Great resources for anyone interested in harvest strategies or people developing the harvest strategies. There are also a series of animations about basic fisheries management concepts and harvest strategies on the DPIRD website in that same section. And the national guidelines themselves include links to some, for example, a development toolbox, some more information sort of sections.
Oh, great. Well, there's a lot of information there.
Yeah.
A lot of resources for people. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. It's been great.
Cheers.
Thank you.